I went through a period years ago of binging dystopian fiction. It was so interesting to look at these worlds gone totally awry. These days, I cannot bring myself to read dystopian fiction. Feels a little too real. Like we read those as a guidebook, or someone did. 1984, Catch-22, A Handmaid's Tale. Octavia Butler's climate dystopia, Parable of the Sower, begins in 2024 and ends in 2028 with a presidential candidate whose slogan is "Make America Great Again." I don't know what line to the future she had. Dystopian fiction can be really important and powerful. I imagine it like the biblical prophets of old saying, "Look what could happen," crying out warning. But right now, when too often it feels a little bit like we're living it, I found myself drawn to more utopian writing because I don't need to cast my imagination down to all the ways it could go, has gone wrong. I need to be able to imagine how we can together get it a little better, how we can together make it right. And actually, I'm not alone in this at all. There is a contemporary emerging literary and arts genre emerging that is devoted to climate utopia. It's devoted to imagining a better way forward where we get our relationship to the earth right and avoid disaster and sink into balanced ways of being. The genre is called solar punk. And as a worship team, we've decided to devote our summer to some climate utopian dreaming, to imagining together how we could shift how we're moving forward in a way that gets it a little more right. And so we've officially named our summer series UUtopias. And it's going to be a really fun time of dreaming together all summer long. I'll do some preaching. We'll have some lay preaching. We're just going to dream it all together. We're going to find our sources of inspiration, not for slide into dystopia, but for climb into something better. So this UUtopias series is going to be so fun, but I'm quietly calling it our solar punk summer. So find your weird futuristic outfits, maybe a funny hairdo. Cast yourself into that future, that solar punk future, where we've really gotten our relationships with one another and with the land around us right. I want to start, however, by casting our attention backward, because our faith tradition actually has a long story of utopian dreaming. And I want to start with a story from some of the OG solar punks, the Transcendentalists. So, 1 week and 181 years ago, on June 1st, 1843, a 10-year-old Louisa May Alcott rode in a wagon with her mother, father, and 3 sisters to a sprawling farm with a small, mature apple orchard on 90 acres in Harvard, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. This property would soon come to be called the Fruitlands, and it would become an important tale of dreaming and failing in the history of our faith. Louisa's father, Bronson Alcott, was a Boston Unitarian and a prominent transcendentalist thinker, keeping company with the likes of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was also at this time deeply in debt, so it was his thought partner Charles Lane who purchased the land and moved his family also to what would become a distinctly Unitarian utopia. That's hard to say. 3 times fast. Unitarian utopia. For at least a few months. 15 years prior, in 1828, at the ordination of the Reverend F.A. Farley in Providence, Rhode Island, Unitarian forefather and articulator of our nascent faith, William Ellery Channing, had preached a sermon called Likeness to God, in which he had articulated the quintessential Unitarian theological innovation as they broke away from their dour Calvinist ancestors. He preached what was really the core of the Unitarian heresy, that humans were not inherently sinful or originally damned, but rather were filled with possibility, were made with the capability and indeed with the responsibility to grow in likeness to God, to become ever more morally perfect. More than a decade after that 1828 sermon, disheartened by the persistent old guard institutionalism of their early Unitarian forebears, many of the transcendentalist Unitarians sought a break from institution and society, a return to what they thought were the origins of the human oversoul. But they held on to that core belief in human goodness and likeness to God. They believed that the forces of institution and society were the origins of human suffering and the source of the corruption of what was an originally perfect human spirit. And so they sought a separation from that society, believing that if we could go back to a simpler way and get straight to the unmediated source, our inherent goodness would shine. Think of Thoreau in his cabin in the woods at Walden Pond. But in this case, Bronson Alcott sought to build something larger, a model for how he believed the world could or should be. In the Fruitlands community, no creature would be above another, and all souls would be enriched by days of working the land and nights of philosophical study. They were vegan with a diet of mostly bread and fruit, what vegetables they could grow, and only cold water to drink. He believed that hot water corrupted the spirit. They didn't believe in owning property or using animal labor, intending to work the lands themselves with spades, 90 acres. They used no sweeteners, as sugar was a slaver's crop and honey belonged to the bees. They dressed only in linen and wore canvas shoes because cotton, too, came from slave labor, wool belonged to the sheep, and leather belonged to the cow. Alcott was the clear patriarch of the community, and his ethical standards were genuine and strictly enforced. For this community that he envisioned, he had succeeded in recruiting 8 other adults: a baker, a cooper, that's someone who makes barrels, a nudist, several wealthy amateur philosophers, a school teacher, and a single farmer for those 90 acres with no animals. The nudist, Samuel Bowers, was required to wear a white sheet when out in the open, and soon a posse from the neighborhood town came to investigate the presence of a ghost. After a month of hand digging in the gardens and fields, the height of their idealism was put to the side, and Bronson relented towards using the labor of several farm animals. Even so, most of their crops failed. In her diaries from the time 10-year-old Louisa starts early in her diary, waxing poetic about the beauty of a bracing cold bath, cold water being all that was allowed due to its healthful properties. And as the diary goes on, she speaks of long days planting, harvesting, husking corn till 8 o'clock until she was called in for her lessons in Plutarch in the evening. By the end of her diaries, she describes weeping with her mother. After the school teacher, Ann Page, was expelled for eating a piece of fish, Bronson's wife, Abby Alcott, and their 4 daughters were the only remaining women and did most of the domestic work. When a visitor asked if there were beasts of burden at Fruitlands, she replied, "Only one woman." It appears that Bronson Alcott and Charles Lane spent most of their time during the Fruitlands experiment traveling, philosophizing, and attempting to find new recruits in New York, Providence, and New Haven. On one such trip, they left a nearly empty granary with fields of barley cut but unharvested. With a storm approaching and winter coming, Abby and her daughters spent an entire night carrying in load after load of desperately needed grain. By December of that year, only the Alcotts remained at the Fruitlands. There was almost no food put aside, very little firewood, and a sinking chill in their bones coming through those thin linen clothes. Louise's diary reflects a tearful family conversation one evening in December as they pondered their shared fate. In January, Abby Alcott borrowed money from her brother, rented a farmhouse in a nearby village, and took her 4 daughters with her. Bronson Alcott refused to leave the farm and took to his bed, deeply depressed. Finally, his wife persuaded him to join her and the children, and with the help of Emerson, the family then moved to Concord, where many of Louise's more happy memories take place and are remembered in her future novels. The world was not ready for utopia yet, and those who attempted to found it only got laughed at for their pains, Louisa concluded years later. She herself wrote a satirical remembrance of the experiment 30 years after its unsuccessful inclusion with an 1873 short story entitled Transcendental Wild Oats. So what's the lesson here? Is it that one oppression avoided will ideals are too impractical to live out? That we should abandon our utopian dreams from the get-go, right as we start our summer series we're calling UUtopias? No, let us not learn those hopeless things from the Fruitlands. We could perhaps remark that it takes more than 12 people to sustain a community, that it takes vigilance to avoid trading one oppressive mindset for another, that our ideals are absolutely worthy of striving for and also inevitably embodied imperfectly. And perhaps most importantly, we could take the lesson from Bronson that when we enforce our idea as the idea, we have simply created a dystopia for someone else. We could take the lesson that when it comes to our utopian dreaming, perhaps the relationships are more important than the ideas. I wish someone had told Bronson Alcott that as he sat with his wife and children dreaming about a better world. That we could make it better together by and through how we treat one another. That we could imperfectly live out our ideas together in all the places they meet. Utopian community will always fail if it means forcing an entire group of people to live out one person's vision. That's called authoritarianism. True ideals can only become material in the context of our relationships to one another. And a utopia that sacrifices relationships for ideas is always doomed to fail. You know, it's probably clear from the way they sound that utopia and dystopia come from the same Greek root, or share one Greek root with a different prefix. But they actually entered our vocabulary about 200 years apart. Utopia actually came first. It was a word coined by Sir Thomas More as the title of his 16th century sociopolitical satire, where he imagined in detail a perfect island nation with all living in peace and harmony. And because of the way people have read that work, utopia has since come to mean, as a word, an idealized place, a perfect place. And it's therefore often mistakenly thought to come from the Greek root eu, which means good. Topos means place. So together, they would mean the good place. We're all thinking of that show, yeah. dystopia is the bad place. But this was not actually the word that Moore coined. He was very clear, actually, that he was combining the Greek roots ou and topos. Ou means not. Topos is place. So the original meaning of the word utopia is not the good place, it is no place or nowhere. Utopia means nowhere. Utopia is what cannot be fully material or complete in this world because this world is always changing. Dystopia, on the other hand, appears to have been created in the 1800s as the antonym to the mistaken meaning of utopia as a perfect or idealized place. So from dys and topos, it means the bad place. And actually, with this origin story of dystopia, it really cemented the erroneous meaning of utopia as the good place. So this summer, as we reject the temptation to fall into utopian anxiety, as we make an intentional choice to rather plant ourselves at the gate of hope and dream about a better way, a way with less brutality and more beauty, a way with less cruelty and more care, we turn our hearts toward utopian dreaming, but we do it very carefully, because how we dream matters. We, this summer, I hope, will dream utopia in the original meaning of the word, as a vision outside of time and place, a nowhere and everywhere world of pure possibility that we can look toward but not quite touch, that we can reach toward but not quite grasp, that can change everything about how we live, but that refuses to become a single dictatorial implementation in the world. What if, as we dream our utopias this summer, we strive not for a perfectly good place pulled down into this world, but for a possibility? A utopian good place, a land without struggle, is a dictatorial dream. It closes off possibilities and futures and further unfolding in ways that cannot help but create harm somewhere down the chain. That version of utopia undoes itself because anything made static, final, perfect, or complete will eventually turn into someone's dystopia. That kind of perfect utopia is always achieved via coercion. In an unfolding universe, perfection stops the unfolding. And so we must not this summer or ever set out to build that kind of utopia. But a utopia that is nowhere, that we do not expect to replicate entirely in this world, but rather allowed to remain in the world of ideas, guiding our steps and our relationships in this world. Perhaps that is a utopia that we can get behind, or rather move toward. A utopia not as a destination, but as a guidepost. A utopia as a shimmering vision, ethereal and dreamy, a world that is no place and can thus contain multitudes, is a thing that can lift our hearts. It can inspire our imagining. It can be the gate of hope that guides our journey as we go one step and wheel at a time, caring for one another along the way. In this time of deep suffering and terrible fear, of changing climate and real scarcities, I believe that we need utopian dreaming more than ever. We need to plant ourselves at that gate of hope that Victoria Stafford names. We need wild imaginings of how it could be different, how it could all be better than this cruelty. In the shadow of a vast and death-dealing empire, we need, as a people of faith, to have the clarity to proclaim that it could be different than this. It could be better than all of this brutality. And we need specific dreams of how it could be better, of how we could live with no creature above another, of how we could all thrive. We need those dreams, to imagine them, to taste them, to strategize and change our behaviors and move toward them. We need our utopian impulse. But we need those utopias to be our guide and not our destination. Our dreams for better are necessary and sustaining and galvanizing, but not sufficient for our collective thriving. The kind of utopia we seek requires our relationships and the material realities in which we find ourselves and the well-being of the very fleshy bodies that surround us, that are us, and that are so different from each other. The utopia we seek will be willing to compromise, to come live in a world with other people dreaming other things. In this utopia, we plant ourselves at the gate of hope, and we are rooted in the ground of what is, while we reach into the sky of what could be, never losing track of one or the other, but layering them together. In the utopia of boundless possibility, we peer into our own dreams for something better and tell each other what we imagine, and then we find a way to hold 100 different dreams at once, because none of our dreams is whole by itself. And perhaps we test our utopian dreams against this standard of beautiful multiplicity. If it cannot share space with another's dream, it's not our utopia. We stay our hearts on a shared dream, not of perfection or finality, but of beautiful unfurling and many splendored possibility. In this time of lived climate dystopia, we need utopian dreams because some are anticipating apocalypse and some are hastening it along. And others are numbing themselves with business as usual. And so we need to turn toward dreaming a better way. In this solar punk summer, we can dream a new way forward. And this phrase, a new way forward, has the key to how we avoid the pitfalls of the good place perfect utopias and enter into the wild possibilities of the no place unsettled ever emerging utopias. We dream a new way forward. We do not dream a new world outside of the beautiful, terrible one we have. We love this world more fully. We dream a new way forward together in this world. We are not trying to arrive at a final and unchanging destination. That is the work of control that leads us to dystopia. Rather, we are on a utopian journey, an utopian journey, to no place in particular, but embedded in a beautiful unfolding where it's the hows that we dream about, how we can be together, how we can move into deeper and more loving ways of being. We are not seeking a different world, but more love, more hope, and more joy in this one. We are not building a new land, but a new way of being together in this one. Let's dream that new way together this summer, right here, in the heart of this beautiful, aching, lovely world we share. Welcome to our solar punk summer.